Welcome again, everyone, to this evening's workshop on revising the personal statement for health professions. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye. I'm the Director of Advising and Programs and the Health Professions Advisor at Barnard. And I am very excited to talk to you all today a little bit about how to move from a draft to eventually a final version of a personal statement as you're preparing for an application to health professions programs. So today, my hope is to talk a little bit about what the next steps are. Anyone who is participating in our committee process has either a draft or an outline of their personal statement so far, so everyone has been making some progress. We want to talk about what next steps can look like. I'm going to talk you through a few specific techniques that I encourage folks to use for different aspects of the revision process. And then we're going to talk about some tips to strengthen your statement's content and structure and just some general resources at the end. And of course, we'll save some time for Q&A. For those who are here live, if you are adding any questions to the chat, it's just tough to see while I'm presenting, so I'll come around to them at the end if I don't get to them during the presentation. So, pretty simple agenda, and we'll jump right into talking about what we do after a first draft. So, revision is, I think, sometimes a kind of intimidating process. And especially in my earlier life writing, it was difficult for me to think about, how I could use this process effectively. Revision is really about critically evaluating the effectiveness of your writing with respect to the goal that you have in doing that piece of writing. I think that the first step is actually to take a break. Once you have spent a lot of time on a draft, it's helpful to just put it away for a couple of days so that when you come to it, you're seeing it a little bit more clearly, perhaps, than you would if you kind of just jumped right into an initial revision. Revision can and should assess a lot of different aspects of your writing. Of course, the content, but also the structure, tone, voice, and grammar. And I'm going to speak specifically to each of those aspects of writing as we go through the presentation today. Revision is, as I said, really challenging. It's labor intensive. And I think that that is, one of the things that makes it difficult. You do have to commit time to it and you have to commit energy. Also, evaluating your own writing can be really hard. Admitting that you need to change something, etc., that's challenging for most people. If you are sharing your writing with others in order to receive feedback, which is great and often a really important part of the process, you can feel vulnerable about sharing what you're sharing with those people. And of course, you as a writer are never entirely sure about the exact parameters of the audience your writing is going to reach, even though in a health professions application, you are writing for generally a specific audience of admissions committees. Those committees are made up of different people who have different perspectives, and we should not expect them all to agree on your writing or any piece of writing. Revision can also feel like a challenge when you're feeling kind of stuck. You don't know what you want to change. You don't feel like something is finished, but you are not sure how to get it to that finish line. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, how to address some of these challenges. Firstly, approaching it from multiple angles. And keeping in mind that revision is really closely tied to the goal that you have for your writing. And remembering that this essay, the personal statement for an application to health professions programs, is at bottom an argument for admitting you to that program. So you want to keep that goal in mind and try to remember that your goal with the essay is really to help an admissions committee understand enough about you to want to hear more and to want to speak to you in person through an interview. So I think that one of the ways that you can sort of throw things against the wall and see what sticks is trying a few exercises that I've used for a while in talking to folks about writing. And so I want to talk to you through a few of these. I'll talk you through the steps and what you want to look for. We won't do the exercises in real time today just because it's tough to do in the virtual or asynchronous format. But if you're watching this recording later and you want to try, just pause me. So the first one does require a partner. It's super helpful if you are able to work with someone maybe who's also going through a process similar to yours, but this works with anybody. The exercise is to sit with a partner and take turns talking through your essay without reading the text. So give each partner a couple of minutes, and person A speaks, talks about what their essay is trying to communicate. Person B listens, and then you switch. After both partners have shared, you take a moment to write down keywords from your own essay and keywords from your partner's essay. And then the final step is to share your list with each other. And here, you're really looking for how well your list matches with the list of the person who read your essay, right? Are you communicating things that the other person is able to hear? And do you and your partner understand your terms in the same way, right? So talking a little bit about the lists that you write down and thinking about examples of, where you're drawing those keywords from can be super helpful. I think that this particular exercise is really helpful in assessing your overall comfort with the content that you're sharing, as well as the logic and flow of your essay overall. So this is kind of a blunt instrument, but it's really helpful to consider the keywords both from your perspective and the reader's in order to assess whether your intended meaning is generally coming across. Second exercise is about originality of the writing itself. Here, I think it's helpful to use a physical copy, or you can use a virtual one and a highlight tool and simply highlight any sentences in your essay that could have been written by someone else. This is sometimes a little bit of a scary exercise, but I think it's really helpful for understanding like how similar this piece of writing may be to lots of other pieces that admissions personnel are reading. If you have a ton of highlighting, your essay could be very similar to other people's. You may not be expressing your individual perspective as clearly as you possibly could. And if you're seeing a lot of highlighting, to me, that suggests a total restructuring of the work is probably important rather than just changing individual sentences, right? You want to think about, okay, is there a different approach that I could take to this writing that may help me express my unique perspective in a more original and individualized way? The third exercise I think is really helpful for checking out the structure of your essay and how well it works overall. So it's called reverse outlining, and a reverse outline is basically where you take something that is already written and fit it with an outline. So next to each paragraph, write down the main idea or the argument in as few words as possible, trying to just like keep it to this is the basics for each stage. This is a really helpful exercise, I think, because it can allow you to kind of do some diagnostics on a few different things. If you're finding it really tough for a particular paragraph to come up with a succinct summary phrase, it might be the case that the paragraph isn't doing a ton for your argument. It's not necessarily supporting it as directly as you would like to. If you're finding that your summary is getting pretty long, that suggests maybe that paragraph is more than one paragraph and actually needs to be kind of restructured, split apart, and perhaps ordered a little bit differently. You can also consider through this exercise how well the ideas you are sharing support your goal in the essay, of course. You can think about how logical the order of arguments is, particularly if you put yourself in the shoes of a reader who is not you, right? I mean, when we're writing about our own experiences, one of the tricky things is that we're often we're able to fill in the gaps, and a reader is not going to be. So making sure that arguments are making sense in making sense to people who are, who do not have your experiences, who are not in your head. And this particular exercise, I think, is really helpful for asking yourself if the reader is having a consistent experience in reading the essay. Does your reader sort of see where you're going? Is there a build to what you're saying? Is there progress? Is there narrative? These are all things that can make personal statements much more successful. Then one more exercise. This one's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more time intensive, but it can be really helpful in instances where you're feeling stuck. So I call this one revisioning. I like to take a draft and mark it up to highlight sentences that I think are working really well. Sentences that I really like, sentences that really seem to be expressing something true about me that I really want to have expressed in the essay. And then for each sentence, you take it over to another document and use it as the start of a new free writing process. I say 10 to 15 minutes here. I mean, you can do whatever time you want, but essentially, you want to take a sentence that you already like and use that as a new beginning to see where it takes you. It's okay if it takes you away from your original idea because you may find one that you like more. And repeating this process multiple times can help you to generate additional text that will allow you to restructure your essay. And this, as I said, is really helpful when you're feeling pretty stuck. Particularly if you're struggling with generating more writing because you're feeling like, I don't know if I have ideas. This is a way to build on the ideas that you've already had uh, without kind of restricting yourself, I guess. This exercise I also think is really helpful when you're in a place where you want to do more of a large scale overhaul or a restructuring. And I think that it's helpful because the idea here is that you're playing to the strengths of your existing writing in order to give you a solid basis for moving forward with potentially a new version of your essay. And that's something that I want to encourage folks not to be afraid of, right? You know, the first version of your essay could have some similarities. It could be very similar, in fact, to the thing that you finally do submit to professional programs, but it could also be very different because, you know, we're talking about like a piece of writing that has qualities aside from the ideas that it's trying to communicate. You may find in writing a draft that you've not really gotten to where you want to be using that idea and you want to try something else, that's okay. It does not have to be the thing that you always thought that you would write about, for example. And with that said, I want to talk a little bit about the different areas that you can think about in revision and places that it may be helpful to consider different approaches. So the first thing is content. Of course, this is usually a consideration that's relatively early in the process, right? People start to think about what do I want to share? You know, what stories do I want to tell? All of that kind of stuff is definitely really important to consider. And when you are thinking about a draft that exists, you want to consider the content from a few different angles. Firstly, does the reader get a clear picture of why the information you're sharing is relevant to the goal of your piece of writing? You also want to think about the proportions of content. This is probably like my number one comment on essays, is that, you know, potentially you may be spending a lot more time telling a story than interpreting the story for the reader, when in reality, the balance should be the other way around. In most cases, we should keep the storytelling details as concise as we can so that we have enough space in a personal statement to really unpack those things and to draw conclusions that the reader hopefully agrees with. So thinking about, you know, what is in the essay now, and is there potentially an argument for changing the amount of space that a particular piece of the essay takes up? Here you want to think about what every paragraph contributes to the essay. That's where a reverse outline can be really helpful. And similarly, what each sentence contributes to a paragraph. Because you have relatively little space in these personal statements, it is important to know that, you know, you may not be able to include as much detail as you would like to, or as much detail as you are accustomed to in telling a particular story. What works here has to work for the logistical strictures that your application service provides you in terms of the length limit. And with that in mind, you cannot be afraid to cut sentences that you love or to cut details that are important to you. These things can mean a lot to us as individuals, but maybe sometimes do not always function as well as we would like them to in a writing context. So be ruthless in your revision. Remember that you may not be able to rely on language that you are very used to in telling a particular story. You might have to switch it up again because there are limitations. With respect to content, I also always encourage folks to, you know, reconsider your thesis. What's the main point? What the takeaway that you want a reader to have? and to think about how that's evolved during your writing process, right? Especially if you're using some of the exercises I've suggested, you might come to the end of your revision process in a very different place than where you started, which is great. But you can also consider whether there's additional room for change that will get you to a personal statement that you are genuinely happy with, right? I mean, it's hard to say when a piece of writing like this is truly ever finished. We have to put a stop to it eventually. And so thinking about when you're going to be comfortable putting that stop is important to consider. Thinking about what your reader needs to know or understand. This is incredibly important, especially when we're thinking about, proportions of the essay. If you're telling a story, need to think about the level of detail that is required for the person to understand the point that you're trying to make. And sometimes you can only use that minimum of detail. You may not have the room to do more. Um, it's also important to consider when you're, thinking about what you're putting into the essay, um, that specific and very detailed writing can convey ideas more precisely, right? When we're thinking about an exercise like highlighting a sentence that someone else could have written, thinking about how you're imbuing the writing with your point of view, and how precisely you're able to identify, your motivations, your goals, things like that, that will help the reader get a really strong sense of the perspective that you're bringing to this application. Structure, I think sometimes is not folks' favorite part. It's my favorite part of revising, thinking about like where can we move things and where will they be most effective always makes me really happy for some reason. I think that it's important always in revision. So a real process of revision is never just like changing a few words here and there. It typically means, okay, I've got this writing. I like a lot of this. I may need to change things around, move things so that I am making the point that I want to. Um, Structural changes can help you do a lot of things. Number one, you can highlight the strongest ideas in your original draft by positionally highlighting them, right? Like putting them early in the essay, like referring to themes and things like that. All of that can really help. Reordering sections of your essay is quite common. It is absolutely fine if the piece of writing that you come up with is told in an order that is not the order in which things happened, in linear time. Thinking about what's going to work best for this piece of writing is much more important. Structural changes also typically mean cutting, things that are not strictly necessary for the reader to understand, or maybe sections that you've tried to fit in but aren't connecting as well with the rest of the essay. Structural change also allows you, as I kind of referred to before, to think about what implications you want the reader to be able to draw. You want to think about where you're leading the reader in terms of the stories that you're telling, the analysis that you're providing. And of course, structural changes can help you to like kind of strengthen the transitions between different pieces of a statement. Does your essay have a narrative is a really important question for you to ask yourself when it comes to structure, because moving things around can sometimes help that flow of ideas progress much better. Ways to address this, I think, are either, first of all, to ask a friend. Somebody doesn't have to be, in a process like this, but just ask them to read it and tell you, are there things that don't make sense to you in this? Are there things here that you're kind of that you feel you're missing information about, etc. Um, Also, I am a really big advocate for each of us as individual writers reading our writing out loud. It feels really weird to do it, and obviously, don't let anyone else hear you. But the process of reading it aloud can really help you to kind of anticipate places where readers might stumble with like elements of the syntax or maybe word choice or things like that. So I think it's a really really helpful exercise that requires no outside input, which is nice for a process like this. I also encourage folks to consider things like sentence structure and length. You want to, as you're reading, especially if you're doing that reading out loud thing, think about, if a sentence is going on really, really long, and it feels like maybe it's a little distracting. Okay, are there ways to kind of arrange these ideas differently that allow me to present them in an order that is conducive to narrative? You want to think about whether there are gaps in your logic, in any argumentation. If you're making, a claim in your essay, um, is it well supported by the rest of what you're saying? Here, I think it's really important to pay attention to transition words, because sometimes we'll, next, comma, blah, 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 we'll kind of link things together using these transition words without really doing the work to link the ideas. And that's something to pay attention to. So looking at places where you've kind of used words to help facilitate a transition to make sure that it's as well supported as it possibly can be. Some signs that you may need to do some structural work include lots of those time words, so things that are linking things together. Keeping in mind, as I said before, that you are not bound by linear time in this writing, and expressing ideas in a linear fashion is not necessarily the best way to do it. Often it is not the best way to do it for a personal statement. Number one, actually telling a story just sort of like this and this and this and this can sometimes feel a little bit impersonal. It feels like you're not analyzing the experiences, you're just sort of like telling a whole long story. Whereas if you are making more critical decisions about like the things that you want to foreground because they're most important, even if they're things that happened later, that shows that you've thought about the importance of what you're trying to express to the reader. It's also important to remember, and I will say this every single time I talk to any of you about a personal statement, you do not have the space to include everything. You will not be able to be exhaustive in this personal statement. You will not be able to tell the complete story of your life and your ambitions. It is physically impossible in the space of 4,500 to 5,300 characters, which is the range typical for some of our big application services. You only have space to express a pretty brief set of ideas. And so letting go of an expectation that you're going to be able to be comprehensive is, I think, healthy at this stage. If you've got a lot of list words, etc., here you want to think about whether you are doing something that I call a prose CV, meaning you're just kind of listing and talking about experiences without really analyzing them or putting them together in a significant way for the reader. Remember that different sections of the application have different purposes. You will, in all of these applications, have a section for writing about your experiences in detail. That's not what the personal statement is here to do. The personal statement is here to express an aspect of the perspective that you're bringing to your profession. It may involve referring to an experience or two, but you are not describing those experiences the way that you would in writing about the experiences section. Thinking about tone. So, kind of what do you leave the reader with? What's the feel of your writing? It's important to consider a lot of things. First of all, if you are, again, making any kind of claims, are the opinions that you are expressing fact-based and well-reasoned? Are these things that you can clearly express in a space like this? Are you extrapolating appropriately from your experiences? Think about, if you're, for example, telling a particular story, are there other ways that that story might be interpreted, especially by people who have more or different experiences? Remembering that, you're early in your career, you haven't yet seen everything that you're going to see. And even things that you write about, you may see in a different light in the future. When negative experiences are part of a personal statement, and I will say, I don't think that it's wrong for a challenging experience to be part of a personal statement at all. I think that it is important, though, that the tone of the essay not feel negative. So, for example, a lot of people have had tough experiences with respect to like access to healthcare, right? In this country, access to healthcare uh, is tough, based on where you are geographically, based on income, based on all sorts of, structural determinants of health, as many folks are familiar with. And and I think that it is very reasonable that lots of people are drawn to clinical careers, partly out of a desire to address those structural factors and try to make healthcare a more equitable place for everyone. Um, so, if I'm writing about an experience maybe where I had trouble getting the care that I needed for a particular issue, I'm going to try to avoid like blaming particular actors and rather focus on why that experience was inspiring to me and how I want to move forward from it, what it helps me to clarify about the career that I want to have, et cetera, right? So taking a negative experience and really making sure that I'm presenting it in a forward-thinking way. I also consider things like vocabulary. Word choice is important, obviously, in writing. Think about what the vocabulary that you're using will say to a reader, right? Um, I think sometimes people get really invested in thesaurus.com and, trying to make things sound a little, I guess like, high and fancy and things like that. It's okay for your essay to be a little bit more relaxed, right? If it's a word that you would not normally use, it's probably not a word that you need to use in a personal statement. Making sure that your personal statement presents you as someone who is both intelligent and, capable of complex thinking and all of that stuff, but also approachable, right? Someone um, who is eager to communicate with others is important. So just do a pass for anything that seems a little ostentatious and give it a second consideration at least. Voice can be kind of similar to tone, but for me, it's more tied to like you and sort of how you are expressing yourself well in this kind of an essay. Here is where readers who know you are super helpful. Someone who's a close friend and has known you for a long time. Parents can sometimes be difficult because maybe their perceptions of you are not the same thing that you would like to express. Although if you have a good solid relationship with a parent who can give you the real feedback, then great. But readers who can tell you, does this piece of writing sound like you? Does this sound like the person that you know is really important because you want this piece of writing to be a preview for the reader. You want the reader to come away from it wanting to talk to you, and when they talk to you, you want them to kind of be expecting the person who wrote that essay to show up and have that conversation. Thinking about, again, how well what you're saying connects with the intended readership, how well it's speaking to your goal of being admitted to a professional program. And here, I think it's really helpful for you to consider what questions someone who reads the essay will have for or about you. It is a good thing for there to be additional questions. These shouldn't be gaps in the logic or reasoning, but it should be kind of, further implications of what you're saying in this essay, you know, generates the fodder for a really productive conversation. So thinking like, what's someone going to want to know next? Trying to anticipate is very helpful. And then finally, in terms of considerations, I want to talk a little bit about concepts that are often described using the word grammar. So firstly, many of you know I have a PhD in linguistics. This is the only thing I ever trained for in my life. So I'm going to share a little bit of linguistics with you. From my perspective, as somebody who has that training, what we call grammar in popular parlance is a set of conventions. Linguists distinguish between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. So linguists are people who are interested in describing how, like, the language that people use. Prescriptive grammar is like what's in manuals and English textbooks when you're in school and things like that. And I personally am not super interested in prescriptive grammar and kind of, changing changing the way that language is used to conform to like particular standards. However, I think that it's important to know, that uh, different people have different perspectives. So for me, writing or speech that conforms to prescriptive conventions is not objectively better in any sense than writing or speech that doesn't. However, there are people who have an idealization of something like standard English, despite the fact that that may not actually represent any one person's individual actual use of language. It's still a concept that is in the minds of readers. And since most of the people who will read your essay are not linguists and have not heard me on my soapbox about that, unfortunately, I would like the world to have to listen, but here we are. Um, I am talking to you about revising for grammar from the sense of appealing to your audience, meeting the conventions that are expected in this particular scenario of personal statement writing. So, to be specific, check on things like your verbs, especially as you're, making changes and things. It's really easy for things like subject and verb agreement, for number or person to get out of whack. Making sure that your verb tenses are consistent throughout the essay, that you're not sort of switching back and forth willy-nilly, checking for sentence fragments. Are there, like subjects, objects, verbs, all that sort of stuff in your sentences? Are you expressing complete ideas in each aspect of your writing? Prepositions should have objects. People don't like prepositions at the end of the sentence. It's, again, we all speak this way, but in a more formal context, think about things like that, about pronoun antecedent relationships. So that means like if you introduce a person, you're writing about Amanda and then you say she later, making sure that, those relationships match up always, and you're using the right pronouns in places where you have referred to the subject earlier. And then a couple of like just common things that I see people sometimes struggle with: the difference between who, which is subject of a sentence, and whom, which is the object of a sentence. Um, less, which is used with things that you can't count, and fewer, that is used with things that you can count, and other kinds of quantification words. People get really annoying about this. Things like contraction and possessives, which is really much more about spelling anyway, but doing a good pass to make sure that you are presenting something that has as few reasons for someone to criticize it as possible is really the name of the game here. Punctuation, which to me, ex-linguist, has nothing to do with grammar, but it is important for writing, is something that you should, I think, do last. For me, revision is about like, the thoughts, the expression, the language itself. And editing is for things like spelling and punctuation and all of that sort of stuff. So make all of your changes first and then make sure that all of your punctuation is consistent. I think that's the most important thing. I've given some like general guidelines for when to use what kind of punctuation here. But honestly, as long as you're consistent in your usage throughout the piece, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. And if you're unsure about something, listen, join the club. Because prescriptive grammar is not actually in anyone's mind, it's confusing to a lot of people. And so you should not feel bad about that, but you should know that there are tons of resources out there, lots of style guides. Of course, you can Google questions, all that sort of stuff, if you are ever unsure about some convention here. All right, some tips, and then we will move it into questions. So the most important thing, give yourself time. If you're here today or you're watching this, soon after the recording, I think you're in a good place because you've got months before the admission cycle is going to open, and now is a really good time to be starting this process so that you have plenty of room to breathe with it. Revision is a nonlinear process. You're gonna cycle through it a few times. It's also gradual and it's very frustrating sometimes. But if you get frustrated, don't let that derail you. Maybe put a pin in one section of an essay and try working on something else, or just taking a break for a day or two and then coming back to it. Taking breaks between like full passes through drafts are also really, really helpful. And then, of course, Getting feedback. Some kinds of feedback, as I've discussed, are really helpful when they come from people who know you super well. Other kinds of feedback can actually be really helpful when a person doesn't know you super well personally, because then they're, sort of approximating the experience of the admissions personnel reader. A couple of last things. I know that, there's a lot of talk about use of AI in all sorts of things that college students and recent graduates and many professionals are doing these days. I want to talk about just a couple of things that I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind with respect to AI in the world of personal statement writing. As you might imagine, this has been super controversial. We have a pre-health advisors, like a professional organization, and when ChatGPT rolled out, it was bleak in the listserv, friends. It was very very unsettling, and people have very strong opinions and very different opinions about the use of generative AI for writing, especially around personal statements. I think it's important for you to know that there are schools who are public about the fact that they're using AI to assist with application review in some senses. There are no universal standards for use. The AAMC has produced some guidance for schools, but there's nothing binding there. No one tells these individual programs how to do their application review process. I've linked here an AAMC news article that quotes several admissions deans talking about the ways that their program uses this technology in assisting with application review. Um, they generally do claim, of course, that it doesn't replace human review of applications, but it's helpful for them in early stages for particular types of review, most typically. The other thing that I think it's important for you to know as an applicant are the standards that your application services will set for applicants. So there are a couple of examples here from AMCAS, the MD application service, and ADSAS, which is the dental school application service. AMCAS specifically notes that AI tools can be used in brainstorming, proofreading, editing, but asks applicants to certify that all final writing submissions are a reflection of their own work. And ADSAS is different. ADSAS actually requires applicants to certify that everything that they've written is not written by a third party. Whether a language learning model is a party is an unanswered question as far as I'm concerned. So understanding, what's going to be in the agreements that you're signing when you hit submit on your application, and making sure that you are behaving in a way that's consistent with those expectations is important. For me personally, I am not, and nor do I really have the time or inclination to be the AI police. So if you find uses for it that are helpful for you, I'm not going to judge that. I do think that it's important to think about, potential positives and negatives. As I have said repeatedly this evening, the process of generating writing, revising writing is both difficult and rewarding. I hope that what I have, shared through this session, as well as my original drafting session, is that I genuinely do think that the introspection that is required of the writing and revising process for personal statements is very valuable. It is helpful to do these exercises to know yourself better and to be able to best express your point of view to other people. AI can suggest words and it can give them an order, but it doesn't know you, obviously. And so, if you're using it in a generative way for generating writing, I would say, think about the the potential, I guess, pros and cons. One additional thing I would say, because we're sort of in the wild west of this kind of technology, and we don't know if the owners of all of these language learning models, what they're doing with anything that is being entered. So if you are writing about other people in any sense, I would really carefully consider their privacy with respect to what you're entering into any AI tool. Not to say that it's impossible to do this ethically, just saying think about it, and think about what information you're sharing with these these robots and the people behind them. Finally, a couple of resources to be aware of. So I'm going to be doing a final writing workshop at the end of March. That's going to be about writing the experiences section of the application. Before that, I'm going to do a workshop on developing a school list. That's going to be later in the month of February. I will send an update and information to everyone who's applying this year about that. I also link here to some of the resources for writers via Barnard's Writing Fellows program. They have a lot of like just helpful general style guides. So for things, that you're sort of checking what's the convention, they can be super helpful there. And I want to encourage everybody to keep an eye out for an upcoming announcement of conferences with writing fellows for health professions applicants. So every year we do this, we offer some conference hours. These are open to both current students and alums, which is different from the typical working style of the writing fellows. Typically, it's only current students, but alums will be able to take advantage of these as well. And these are, I think, really, really helpful as ways for applicants to get feedback from people who maybe don't know them super well about particularly the effectiveness of the writing. So, of course, this doesn't replace things like talking with me about, how a particular thing might be perceived in an admissions process, et cetera. But it, I think, is really helpful for evaluating your writing in a broad sense. And that's it for my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and come back to where I can see people. I'm going to share the slides and the recording of this session with all applicants. So that should happen tomorrow, Wednesday, before the end of this week, definitely. So you all will get all of the links and the texts of the exercises, et cetera, et cetera. Before we break though, specific questions? Anything anyone wants to clarify, or anything I didn't cover that you have questions about? Going once. All right. Well, I'm here, obviously. So if questions arise as you are working through your revision process, please don't hesitate, reach out. If it's a quick question, please feel free to email me. If you've got a whole list of them, you can set up a time to talk. I am available to provide comments on advanced drafts of personal statements, things like that. So if you want comments, you can just send me an email with the document as an attachment, and we'll move from there. And there was one question in the chat. Tips for dealing with contrasting advice on essay topics. I think you get contrasting advice on writing because you get contrasting points of view on writing, unfortunately. I think that ultimately you should consider any advice with a grain of salt, and you should think about how well option A and option B, or however many options there are, express what you want to express in this particular format. I think a lot of different kinds of topics can be successful personal statements, or can be part of successful personal statements. I think that for every individual person, there are probably a number of different ways that they could approach a personal statement. And sometimes the only way to really tell the difference between them is to actually write them. So I know that that's not advice that anyone wants to hear, because it is more work, but I really do think, and I use this metaphor all the time, even if you are an incredibly good baker and an incredibly, accomplished baker, and you can look at a recipe and you can know like, hey, the proportions look right. This, the leavening looks like it's not going to go crazy. This is the right proportion of like, hydration to flour, et cetera, et cetera. All of that stuff you can know in a certain sense, but you're never going to be able to truly evaluate the thing that you're baking until you bake it, right? So if you have a couple of different ideas, my suggestion is always try them all and see what actually works best at expressing your perspective, and what allows you to use the space that you have in the best way functionally in your writing. So there may be ideas that you have that are, like wonderful and very true and like very true to you and the perspective that you bring, but you may just not be able to do them in the space that you have. Whereas something that you might not initially think is, sort of the most important thing for you to share, um, could be something that is much more effective in in the logical structure, the logistical structure of the personal statement. That's a really good question, Lillian. Thank you for asking. Um, and any other? Okay, I haven't seen any new ones, so I'll say good night. Thank you all so much for being here. Please do take a look at the slides and try out these exercises and let me know as you have questions. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye bye.